David Ford had built every last fence post, every hand-hewn beam, and every stone in the fireplace of the Crosswind Ranch, with one woman's name living quietly in his chest like a second heartbeat. And by the time he drove the final nail into the front porch railing and turned around to admire what he had made, that woman was already 2 states away and married to someone else. The year was 1883, deep in the rolling grasslands of West Texas, where the sky was so wide and so blue it felt like God had pulled back a curtain and forgotten to put it back. The land around Laramie Creek was good land, honest land, the kind that rewarded a man who worked it straight and punished one who cut corners. David had worked it straight. He had worked it like a man possessed, because in some ways that was exactly what he was. Her name had been Clara Whitfield, a schoolteacher's daughter from San Antonio with dark eyes and a laugh that carried across the street. David had courted her for 2 years before her letters began arriving less frequently, and then not at all, and then finally one last envelope that contained a single page of neat handwriting explaining that she had accepted a proposal from a banker from Austin, a man of steady income and predictable hours, a man whose hands were smooth and whose coat always fit properly. She wished David well. She hoped the ranch would prosper. He had read that letter 3 times, folded it precisely, walked to the fireplace and burned it. Then he had gone outside, sat on the porch he had built for her, and looked at the evening star for a very long time. That had been 8 months ago. Now it was a Tuesday in late April, and David was 31 years old, brown from the sun, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the weather turned humid. He was not a brooding man by nature. He was a practical man who had temporarily misplaced his practicality somewhere in the grief of a quiet heartbreak, and he was slowly finding his way back to it, the way you find your way back to a familiar road after dark, step by cautious step, trusting the ground to hold. The Crosswind Ranch had cattle, 47 head of good longhorn stock, a small herd of quarter horses he sold in the spring to ranchers moving stock north, 2 barn cats whose names he had never officially assigned, though he called the orange one Biscuit and the gray one nothing in particular, and a hired hand named Eli Crockett who was 62 years old, built like a fence post himself, and entirely too opinionated for a man who accepted wages. Eli had worked cattle since before David was born. He had ridden drives up to Abilene in the old days, before the railheads moved and the trails changed, and the wire fences began cutting across the open range like stitches across skin. He wore the same battered hat every single day regardless of the weather, and he had a habit of whistling hymns off-key while he worked, which should have been irritating and somehow was not. On this particular Tuesday morning, Eli came in from the south pasture while David was repairing a section of corral fence, and he leaned against the post with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders the way he did when he was about to say something he knew David would not want to hear. "Stage is running late again," Eli said. "It runs late every week," David said, not looking up from the fence rail. "This week there is a different kind of late. Tom Hadley at the depot says there was a problem on the Abilene Road, some confusion about passengers. That is not my concern." "Might be your concern," Eli said, and his voice had taken on that particular quality it got when he was being deliberately oblique. "Hadley says one of the passengers ended up on the wrong stage out of San Marcos, woman traveling alone. She had a ticket for a ranch near Beaumont, but she ended up here." David set down his hammer. "Here in town." "Here at the depot. Arrived this morning with 1 trunk and a carpet bag and a ticket that says Crosswind." Eli paused. "Our Crosswind?" David stared at him. "We are not expecting anyone." "I am aware of that." "There must be another Crosswind something." Hadley checked. "There is not another one in this territory." Eli squinted at the horizon. "Woman says her name is Lenora Vaughn. She is from back east somewhere. Missouri," Hadley thought. "She is sitting on her trunk at the depot right now looking like she is trying very hard not to appear alarmed." David pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose and breathed out slowly. I will go into town and sort this out." "I figured you would," Eli said, and went back to whistling his off-key hymn. The town of Laramie Creek was not a large town, but it was a real one, with a main street that had been properly graded and packed with caliche, a dry goods store run by the Hendricks family, a telegraph office, a barber, a small hotel called the Piedmont that had 4 rooms and a dining room that served decent beef stew on Fridays, and a train depot that also served as the stage stop, the post office collection point, and the general waiting area for anyone passing through or arriving. David tied his horse at the rail outside the depot and pushed through the door. He saw her immediately, because she was the only person in the waiting area, seated very precisely on a large trunk with a carpet bag beside her feet, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap in a way that communicated a great deal of determined composure. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that was dusty from the road, and her hair, which was the color of autumn wood, was pinned up, but had come loose in a few places in the way that long travel tends to do to even the most carefully arranged hair. She had a heart-shaped face and green eyes that were currently fixed on the wall across from her with an expression that was focused and careful and entirely unconvincing as a display of calm. Tom Hadley, the depot manager, was behind his counter looking relieved to see David arrive. "Mr. Ford," Hadley said, "this is Miss Vaughn. She came in on the 9 o'clock stage. Her ticket says Crosswind Ranch." The woman turned and looked at David, and something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, but a kind of careful assessment, a measuring look that was neither frightened nor falsely confident. "Mr. Ford," she said, and her voice was clear and level, "I apologize for the inconvenience. I was told in San Marcos that the stage ran to a ranch called Crosswind, and I purchased a ticket accordingly. I can see now that there has been some confusion." David took off his hat. "There has been," he agreed. "I am not expecting any arrivals. Can you tell me where you were actually trying to get to?" She opened the carpet bag and withdrew a folded letter which she held out to him. He took it and read it. It was a letter from a placement agency in St. Louis, addressed to a Mr. R. Caldwell of Crosswind Ranch near Beaumont, confirming the arrival of Miss Lenora Vaughn, age 26, a schoolteacher seeking a domestic position with a reputable household in the Western Territories. "There is a Caldwell Ranch near Beaumont," Hadley offered from behind his counter. "I cannot say if it is called Crosswind." "It must be," David said, folding the letter and handing it back. "The stage lines share the name as a waypoint through this corridor. There has been a booking error." He looked at Lenora Vaughn more directly. "The next stage that runs toward Beaumont does not leave until Thursday." She received this information with a small nod, as though she had been preparing for bad news all morning and had simply been waiting to learn its specific shape. "I see," she said. "Is there a respectable hotel in town where I might wait?" "The Piedmont. It is decent enough." David turned his hat in his hands. He was a practical man, and practicality was reasserting itself in the way it always did when a situation required it. "Miss Vaughn, I cannot in good conscience leave you sitting in the depot for 2 days. The Piedmont is comfortable but small, and the town is," he searched for the right word, "transitional. There are cattle outfits moving through this time of year, and the hotel fills up and gets loud at night. You would be welcome at the ranch while you wait for your corrected stage." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate the offer. I would not wish to impose." "You would not be imposing. We have a spare room in the ranch house, and my hired man Eli's wife Dorothea comes in 3 times a week to cook and clean. She will be there tomorrow, and she is good company. It would be more comfortable than the hotel." There was a pause in which she appeared to weigh this offer against whatever her internal compass of propriety suggested, and he could see the practical side of her nature engaging the same way as had, measuring the situation honestly. "That is very kind," she said finally. "I accept and I thank you." David nodded and picked up her trunk without being asked, which surprised her, and that surprise appeared as a brief softening around her eyes before she picked up her own carpet bag and followed him out. The ride to the Crosswind took 40 minutes in the wagon. The afternoon was warm, and the land was doing that thing it did in late April, putting out the first green along the creek edges while the higher pastures were still tawny and dry, so that the whole landscape was beginning to wake up in patches, like a painting being filled in from the bottom. David drove and Lenora sat beside him with the carpet bag across her knees, and for the first 10 minutes neither of them said anything, which was not uncomfortable in the way silences can sometimes be, but was instead simply the companionable quiet of two people adapting to unexpected proximity. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, when the town was behind them and the road opened out onto the wide grass. 7 years of working it, 2 years of owning the deed outright," he said. "My father had a place farther east that I sold when he passed, and I put that toward this land. It is very beautiful country," she said, looking at the hills. "It is," he agreed. "Hard country, too. The droughts come hard and the winters can be cruel, but the land is honest." He paused. "You are a school teacher." "I was. The school in my town in Missouri closed when the county funds ran dry. I taught there for 4 years. She did not say it with self-pity, just with the same level clarity she seemed to bring to everything. "I have a sister in Boston and a cousin in New Orleans, and neither place suited me. I prefer open space." She looked at the horizon. "I thought I might do well in Texas." "You might," David said. "Texas has use for teachers. And for domestic help, apparently, which is what the agency placed me as, though I would prefer to teach again eventually." "Laramie Creek does not have a school just now," David said. "The last schoolteacher was Mr. Presley, who left for California 18 months ago, and the county has not replaced him." She turned to look at him with what he thought might be the first genuinely interested look she had given him. "Is that so?" "It is. The children in the area are being taught at home or not at all. It is a gap." She said nothing more on the subject, but he noticed that she looked out at the landscape after that with a slightly different expression. Not just observing it, but reading it, the way you read a place you might be staying in. The Crosswind Ranch came into view around a curve in the road, and David watched Lenora see it for the first time. The house was stone and timber, wide and low, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a roof that had good pitch to shed the rain. There was a kitchen garden on the south side beginning to show its early plantings, a barn that was large and well kept, and the horse pasture beyond it where 3 mares were standing in the afternoon shade of a live oak tree. The whole property had a particular quality that well-built things have, a solidity that communicated care without ostentation. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "With help?" "Eli helped, and 2 men from town I hired for the heavy work, but yes, mostly myself." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is a very fine ranch." He pulled the wagon up to the house and she stepped down before he could offer a hand, which was competent of her. He carried her trunk inside and showed her the spare room, which was on the east side of the house, with a window that looked out across the creek pasture. It was a plain room, a good bed, a washstand, a chair, a small writing desk clean and uncluttered, the room of a man who had furnished it with someone in mind and then simply left it ready. He did not say who he had built it for. She did not ask. Eli appeared at the back door shortly after, hat in hand, and Lenora was introduced to him and was subjected to his particular brand of frank assessment, which he delivered by way of a squint and a slow nod. "You look like you can work," he said to her, which in Eli's vocabulary was a compliment of the highest order. She looked somewhat amused. "I can," she said. "Good. Women who cannot work are a trial in ranch country." He replaced his hat and went back outside, apparently satisfied. David showed her where the kitchen was stocked, where the well was, and where the wood was kept. He told her Dorothea Crockett would be in the next morning by 7 and would see to breakfast. Lenora thanked him with a formality that was not cold but was careful, and he understood that she was a woman calibrating her position in a strange place with a strange man, and that her carefulness was wisdom. not unfriendliness. He went to bed that night in his own room on the west side of the house and lay in the dark for a while listening to the usual sounds, the creek moving, the horses shifting in the corral, the wind coming through the grass, and he noticed, for the first time in months, that the house did not feel quite as empty as it had. He pushed that observation aside firmly and went to sleep. Dorothea Crockett was a stout, cheerful woman of 58 who had followed Eli into every situation without complaint for 33 years, and had formed opinions on nearly every subject on earth, which she shared freely. She arrived at 6:30 the next morning instead of 7, because she had heard about the visitor from Eli the previous evening, and her curiosity was not the sort that waited patiently. By the time David came in from the early morning feeding, Dorothea and Lenora were already in the kitchen drinking coffee together, with the particular ease of women who have discovered they like each other, which in David's experience took men considerably longer to achieve. "Your Miss Vaughn is very sensible," Dorothea told him, as though Lenora were not sitting 3 feet away. "She already knows how to make proper biscuits. Most women from Missouri do not know how to make Texas biscuits." "I adapted the recipe," Lenora said, with that small contained amusement David was beginning to recognize. "She adapted the recipe," Dorothea told David approvingly. David poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the morning, and he was aware that the kitchen felt different with 2 women in it, busier and warmer and somehow more like the house it had been designed to be. After breakfast, Lenora asked if she could be useful while she waited for the Thursday stage, because she was not a woman who sat idle well. David put her to work in the kitchen garden, which needed weeding, and a second planting of beans along the south row. She worked steadily through the morning without complaint, wearing an apron she had found on the hook by the back door, and a practical directness about the work that he found himself watching from the corral fence more than strictly necessary. Eli came up beside him at one point, leaning on the fence. "She is not what I expected," Eli said. "What did you expect? Some soft city woman in a fluster?" Eli tilted his head at the garden where Lenora was kneeling in the dirt between the bean rows. "That is not a woman in a fluster." "No," David agreed. "That is a woman who knows exactly where she is and what she is doing, even though she ended up here by accident." David said nothing. "I have noticed," Eli said conversationally, "that accidents are sometimes more intelligent than plans." "Go check on the south pasture fence," David said. Eli went whistling. At noon, Lenora came inside and washed her hands and helped Dorothea with the midday meal, and the 3 of them ate together, Eli included when he came back in, at the long kitchen table, and there was a conversation about cattle prices, and about the county school situation, and about whether the summer would be as dry as the previous one. Lenora listened more than she spoke, but when she spoke she was direct and without pretense, and she asked questions that showed she was actually thinking rather than filling silence. At one point she asked David what he had named the ranch, and he said Crosswind, and she asked why. "When I was deciding whether to buy this land," he said, "I came out here and walked it for a day. Every direction I turned, the wind was different, coming across the creek from the east, then swinging south, then off the hills to the northwest. I have never been on a piece of ground where the air felt so much like it was moving through something rather than just over it." He stopped, slightly self-conscious. "It seemed like the right name." She looked at him. "It is the right name," she said. It was simply put, and he believed she meant it. That afternoon he took her out to see the horses, because she had mentioned during lunch that she could ride, and he had a feeling that she was the kind of person whose mood improved on horseback, the way some people's do. He saddled the steadiest of the 3 mares, a gray quarter horse named Patience, and watched Lenora mount up with a confidence that was not performative but entirely natural. She had clearly ridden a great deal. They rode out along the creek and then up through the east pasture where the longhorns were grazing, and the afternoon light was golden and moving through the grass in the way it does in Texas when the spring is properly arrived, turning everything to warm copper. David rode beside her and they talked about the land, about the water rights along the creek, about the property line that ran to the Cedar Ridge to the north. "How many acres?" she asked. 640. A full section. She absorbed this, looking across the range. "And you run it with just yourself and Eli, 2 other men in the fall for the drives, otherwise yes. That is a great deal of work for 2 people. It keeps a man from spending too much time in his own head," he said, and she glanced at him with a look that said she heard the thing underneath that statement, but was not going to press on it. They turned back toward the ranch house in the late afternoon, riding side by side through the creek bottom where the cottonwoods were leafing out, and he noticed that she rode with her head up and her eyes moving across the land in the way people do when they are finding something they recognize in a new place. Thursday arrived the way days do when you have mixed feelings about them arriving too quickly, and with the particular quality of a door opening onto something you are not sure you want. David drove her to the depot in the morning. Her trunk was loaded. Her carpet bag was in her lap. Dorothea had sent a parcel of food for the journey, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, which Lenora had accepted with genuine gratitude. Eli had shaken her hand at the gate with the solemnity of a man who does not shake many hands and means it when he does. At the depot, Tom Hadley was behind his counter with a look on his face that David did not like. "I have had a wire from Beaumont," Hadley said, setting a telegram on the counter. David read it. Lenora read it over his shoulder. The wire was from the Caldwell Ranch Agency, informing them that the position of domestic help had been filled in Miss Vaughn's absence, as her delayed arrival had coincided with another candidate coming through by way of Houston, and the household's need had been immediate. Miss Vaughn was released from her placement obligation and would need to seek a new position. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see," in the same level tone she had used when she learned the stage would not run until Thursday, the tone of someone absorbing a blow without showing how hard it landed. "I am sorry," David said. "It is not your fault." She picked up the telegram and folded it into her carpet bag. "Nor mine, for that matter, it is simply circumstance." He was looking at her, and she was looking at the middle distance, thinking. He could see her thinking, the way you can sometimes see it in a person who is genuinely working through a problem rather than reacting to it. "The Beaumont stage still runs today," Hadley offered. "You could go to Beaumont and contact the agency directly for a new placement." "I could," she said. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she looked at David. "You mentioned yesterday that there is no schoolteacher in this county." He was very still. "I did mention that." "Is there a schoolhouse?" "There is a building. It has not been used in a year and a half, needs some work." "Is there a county education board or a civic body that oversees it?" "There is a county commissioner. His name is Arthur Greer, and he has an office on the main street here." David looked at her carefully. "You are thinking of applying to teach?" "I am thinking," she said, "that I came to Texas to be useful, and that I have found a place where I would be useful, even if it is not the place I intended to find." She looked at him directly. "Is there any reason that would not work?" There were several things he could have said. He said the honest one, "None that I can think of." "Then I would like to speak with Commissioner Greer before the stage leaves." She did speak with Commissioner Greer, a wide man with a substantial mustache, and the cautious good sense of a man who has been in local government long enough to recognize a competent person when one appears in his office. She presented her credentials. She had her teaching certificate from Missouri in the carpet bag, because Lenora Vaughn was a woman who kept her important documents with her. And she answered his questions clearly and without flattery, and she outlined what she would need to open the school and what she expected in terms of salary, which was modest and reasonable. Greer looked at David, who was standing just inside the office door. "You vouch for her character, Mr. Ford." David was momentarily arrested by the question, because he had known this woman for approximately 2 days. Then he thought about the garden, about the way she rode, about the telegram she had folded quietly into her bag. "Yes," he said, "I do." Greer offered Lenora a provisional contract, subject to the school being made ready and a minimum enrollment of 8 students, with the understanding that the county would review her position at the end of the school year. She accepted, shook his hand, and they were back on the main street by 11 o'clock. Lenora stood on the boardwalk outside Greer's office and looked at David. "I need a place to board," she said. "The Piedmont," he said. She shook her head slightly. "The Piedmont is adequate, but the noise at night is significant, and you said so yourself. I would need to be rested to do good work." She paused. "You have a spare room?" "I do. Dorothea is there 3 times a week." "She is. I would pay board." He looked at her for a long moment. The street was busy with the morning's business. A freight wagon going past, 2 men from one of the cattle outfits conferring outside the barber's, and the sun was bright and direct and honest. He was aware that his heart was doing something it had not done in a while, some small private movement in his chest that he was not ready to name or examine. "You do not have to pay board," he said. "I will pay board," she said firmly, and that settled it. She sent a wire to her sister in Boston explaining her change of plans. She sent a letter to the agency in St. Louis informing them that she had secured an independent position. She kept the Beaumont stage ticket stub in the back of her writing desk like a memento of the road she had not taken. The schoolhouse was in worse condition than David had described, which he acknowledged when she first saw it. The roof had 2 places where the boards had warped and allowed water in. One window was broken, the stove pipe was disconnected, and the interior smelled profoundly of disuse. "I may have understated the work required," he said. "You may have," she agreed. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes, the bones of the building are sound. It is the particulars that need attention." "Then let us attend to the particulars." He helped her. He did not mean to make it a daily thing, but it became one. After his morning work with the cattle and horses, he would come to town and spend the afternoon hours working on the schoolhouse roof, or the window, or the stovepipe. And Lenora would be inside cleaning and sorting the old books that had been left when Presley departed, making an inventory, writing letters to families in the area about enrollment. Eli took on more of the afternoon ranch work without comment, which was his way of approving something without saying so. They worked side by side in the schoolhouse for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, David Ford came to know Lenora Vaughn in the particular way you know someone when you are building something together, not through formal conversation, but through the small accumulated evidence of who they are when they are focused, when they are frustrated, when they solve a problem, when something makes them laugh. And Lenora Vaughn laughed with more genuine, unconsidered openness than she showed in any other expression. It happened without warning, usually in response to something absurd, and it changed her face completely, broke through all that careful composure like sunlight through clouds, and David found that he was, entirely without intending to, arranging small things in order to see it happen. He fixed the broken window pane and it fell out again, and she laughed. He attempted to reconnect the stovepipe and soot came down in an avalanche across his face and shirt, and she laughed so hard she had to sit on a desk. He told her about Biscuit the cat's ongoing campaign to sleep on the highest shelf in the barn, which required a considerable athletic commitment on the cat's part, and she laughed with her eyes bright and her head slightly back. She was staying in the east room of the Crosswind Ranch house, and every evening after supper, which they ate together, usually with Eli and sometimes with Dorothea, she would sit at the kitchen table and grade her enrollment paperwork or write lesson plans by lamplight, and David would sit across the table with his account books or his maintenance records, and the lamp would burn between them, and the house would be quiet in the good way a house is quiet when it is inhabited by more than solitude. He was careful, he was respectful. He was perhaps more careful and more respectful than was strictly necessary, but he was aware that she was a woman who had arrived at his house by accident, who had taken a situation that might have been humiliating and turned it into something purposeful, and he did not want to do anything that might complicate what she was building here. She was not Clara. She had not been sent for, had not been planned for, had not arrived as the answer to any question he had been consciously asking. But she was there, every morning across the breakfast table, green eyes clear and steady. And she was there in the garden and at the schoolhouse and at the supper table, and the Crosswind Ranch, which he had built for a different woman and a different future, had begun to feel like itself for the first time. He came to understand, slowly, and with the particular reluctance of a man who has been disappointed, and is not entirely ready to stop protecting himself from disappointment, that what he felt for Lenora Vaughn was not gratitude for company or the comfort of routine. It was something specific and stubborn and real, the kind of feeling that does not announce itself grandly, but accumulates quietly until one morning you look across the breakfast table and understand that this person has become necessary to you in a way that has nothing to do with practicality. The school opened on the 12th of May with 11 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, which was more than Greer's minimum of 8, and was a source of visible, undisguised satisfaction for Lenora. She rang the bell at the front of the schoolhouse. David had installed a proper bell at her request, a good cast iron one he had ordered from the hardware catalog, and the children came in and took their seats, and Laramie Creek had a schoolteacher again. David was there that morning. He had not planned to be, but he had delivered a supply of firewood for the stove, and then somehow did not leave immediately, and so he saw it. Lenora standing at the front of the classroom, the morning light coming through the repaired window, and the children looking up at her with the particular attention children give to a teacher who has immediately communicated that they know what they are doing and mean what they say. She was magnificent. There was no other word for it. She was organized and warm and firm in the way good teachers are, and she had clearly already learned something about each of the 11 students before they arrived, because she spoke to several of them by name before they introduced themselves, and the small shock of being recognized went across each of those children's faces like the first lamp being lit in a dark room. He walked back to his horse feeling something so large and specific in his chest that he had to stop and breathe for a moment before he could mount up. That evening, she came home to the ranch house in better spirits than he had ever seen her, which was saying something, since her spirits were generally good. She talked through supper about each of the children, their names, their levels, their apparent difficulties and strengths with the passionate, specific attention of someone describing people they have already begun to care about. David listened. He asked questions, and she answered them with increasing animation until Eli, who had stayed for supper, said dryly, "You have the look of a woman who has found her proper work." And Lenora stopped and considered this and said, "Yes, I suppose I have." The spring moved toward summer, and the ranch entered its busy season branding, the sale of the spring colts, the beginning of preparations for the fall drive. David was out before dawn most days and came in at dusk, and the evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp burning became the fixed point of the day, the thing he worked toward. He began to notice other things, smaller things, that she always left a cup of coffee on the back of the stove for him when she left for school in the morning, and that it was always timed right, still warm but not scalded. That she had developed a habit of asking him about the cattle when they sat down to supper, not out of politeness, but out of genuine interest. That she had begun to learn the horses' names and their personalities, asking Eli questions, and watching the animals with the same careful attention she gave to everything. That when she was worried about something, a student struggling, a lesson that hadn't gone as she'd planned, she went quiet at the table in a particular way, and he had learned to recognize it, and that he found himself entirely naturally asking what was wrong in the same tone he might ask about a fence that needed checking, matter of fact and without pressure. The first time he did it, she looked up from her book with a surprised expression, as though she hadn't expected to be seen. "One of the boys," she said. "The Marsh boy, Caleb. He is 12 and he cannot read, not a word. He has been hiding it remarkably well, but today it became clear. He needs specific instruction and I am not sure I have the right materials." David thought for a moment. I have a set of primers in the storage room. Left over from, he paused briefly. They were here when I bought the property. I never looked at them properly. She looked at him. May I see them? He got them out that evening, 4 McGuffey readers in good condition, and she examined them with the focus of a jeweler examining stones. These are exactly right, she said. The early grade primers. This will do perfectly. She looked up at him across the table. Thank you. It is nothing. It is not nothing, she said. It is Caleb Marsh being able to read by the end of summer, which is something considerable. She held his gaze for a moment, and in it was the particular warmth of a person who sees what is actually being given rather than just what is nominally offered. He could not sleep that night, and he did not entirely mind. June came on hard and hot, the way West Texas June tends to, with a clear, merciless sky and the grass beginning to dry in the upland pastures. David moved the cattle toward the creek bottom where the grazing held longer, and he spent a long Saturday repairing the windmill on the south water tank, which had been troublesome since March. He was on top of the windmill tower in the midday heat, adjusting the brake mechanism, when he heard Patience the mare coming across the south pasture at a canter, and looked down to see Lenora riding with that easy, upright confidence that had surprised him the first time and no longer did, because it was simply part of how she moved through the world. She pulled up at the base of the tower and looked up at him with one hand shading her eyes. Eli said you were out here. I brought your dinner. You missed the midday meal. He had missed it because he had forgotten, which was unlike him, and he was aware this meant something about how absorbed he was in the work. He climbed down the tower and she handed him a cloth-wrapped parcel from the saddlebag cornbread, cold beans, and a piece of dried apple cake that was Dorothea's. You rode all the way out here for this, he said, not quite as a question. The south pasture is not particularly far, she said, dismounting and tying Patience to the windmill post. And I wanted to see the south end of the property. I have not been this far yet. They sat in the shade of the windmill tower and he ate, and she looked out at the land, at the cedar ridge to the north and the way the heat shimmered above the dry grass. She had taken off her hat and held it in her lap, and the wind from the south moved a strand of her hair across her cheek. It is beautiful here, she said, even in the heat, maybe especially in the heat. It is honest. You keep using that word, he said. Honest. She considered it. I think it is the right word for this kind of country. It does not pretend to be easier than it is. You know exactly what you are dealing with. That is true. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ridge. Then she said, with the particular carefulness of someone saying something they have been turning over for a while, I have been thinking about what is next. His hands went still on the cloth wrap of the cornbread. In what sense? The county contract is provisional through the end of the school year, which is September. Commissioner Greer has been encouraging. I believe he will renew it, and I believe I have given him good reason to. She paused. I have been thinking about whether to stay permanently. In Laramie Creek. Yes. She turned to look at him, and her green eyes were steady and direct. I am aware that my presence here at the ranch began as an accident. I would not want to stay where I am not wanted. He looked at her. Everything he had been being careful about for 2 months rose up in him, all the quiet accumulation of it, and there was a moment in which he could have said something measured and appropriate about the boarding arrangement and the practicalities, and he said none of it. You are not simply wanted, he said. You are, he stopped, searching for the honest word, and he found it. You are necessary. To the ranch. He stopped again because the sentences were colliding and he was better with his hands than with his tongue, and he knew it. Lenora, she waited. She was good at waiting. I have not been particularly good company for the first 2 months of your being here, he said. I was carrying something around that was taking up too much room. I want you to know that it does not take up as much room anymore, and that the reason for that is in some measure sitting beside me right now. The directness she always gave him, she gave him now. What were you carrying? He set down the cornbread. I built this ranch for a woman who left before she ever saw it. She went to Austin and married a banker. It was the right thing for her to do, I suppose. but it left me here with a ranch built around an absence, which is a peculiar thing to live inside. He looked at the cedar ridge. I thought the house would feel different once it was finished and occupied. It did not. It still felt empty. He paused. Until you, she was very still beside him. The wind moved across the grass. The windmill turned. David, she said softly. He looked at her. I did not come here by plan, she said. I ended up here by a series of mistakes that, as I have had reason to consider them, were not mistakes at all. I came to Texas looking for a place where I could do real work and be something real. I did not know that was what I was looking for. She held his gaze. I found it, and I have found more than that. He reached out carefully and took her hand where it lay in her lap. She did not pull it back. Her fingers were warm and dry and slightly rough from the garden work, and they curled around his with a certainty that was very like her in everything else, not tentative, not performing, just real. They sat that way in the shade of the windmill tower with the afternoon heat pressing down on the south pasture and the cedar ridge purple-blue in the distance, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and nothing needed to be said. He rode back to the ranch house in the late afternoon, with Patience's hoofbeats and his own horse's hoofbeats moving in matching rhythm across the dry grass, and Lenora rode beside him, and the ranch was ahead of them with the evening light on the stone walls making them warm and golden. Eli was at the corral gate and saw them coming in side by side and said nothing whatsoever, which was its own kind of eloquence. That evening at the kitchen table, they sat across from each other as they always did, but something between them was different in the way the air after a rainstorm is different from the air before it, cleaner and more honest and full of something new. He asked her about Caleb Marsh because Caleb was a real concern and Lenora's thoughts on him were worth hearing. He is reading now, she said, and the pleasure in it was complete. 3 weeks of daily primer work and he is reading. Not fluently, but he is reading. He came to me after class on Friday and read me a sentence from the reader out loud, one that he had clearly practiced, and the look on his face, she shook her head and her eyes were bright. That is what I do this for. You are an excellent teacher, David said. She looked at him. How would you know? You have only seen me on the first day. I know because of how you talk about them, he said. You know each of them as a person, not as a student. That is the thing that makes a teacher excellent or merely adequate. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression that was open and a little surprised. You are more observant than you let on, she said. I observe what is worth observing, he said, and she smiled at that, the full, open smile that was his favorite thing about her face. The weeks that followed had a quality that David would later, in the years ahead, try to describe accurately and find difficult to do so, because the combination of ordinary and extraordinary that makes the best periods of a life is resistant to description. The work was the same, the cattle, the horses, the fences, the endless maintenance of a working ranch in a country that wore things down steadily. But the work was different too, because he was doing it towards something and with someone now, even if that someone was spending her days at the schoolhouse. And the difference between working towards something and simply working is the difference between walking with a destination and wandering. He took her to the county fair in early July, which was held in the larger town of Millhaven 20 miles east. It was a full day's trip there and back, and they went in the buckboard wagon with a picnic lunch Lenora packed, and a sense of occasion that was neither one of them's natural register, but that they were both willing to occupy for the day. The fair was good. There were cattle competitions and horse demonstrations, a quilting exhibition that Lenora studied with serious interest, a pie contest that Dorothea had entered and won second place in for the previous 3 consecutive years. This year she won first, which she accepted with exactly the amount of dignity appropriate to a victory she had clearly been pursuing for some time. There was a fiddle player and a caller doing square dances in the evening in the town hall, and the whole county seemed to be there, and the air smelled of sawdust and roasted corn, and the particular happiness of people who work hard in isolated places spending a day in company. David danced with Lenora. He was not, by his own assessment, a skilled dancer, but he was willing, and she was good enough to compensate for what he lacked in technique, and they moved around the floor of the town hall with the fiddle going and the caller shouting and the other couples moving around them. And she laughed at his determined expression when he was trying to remember the steps of a particular figure, that full open laugh, and he stopped trying to remember the steps and just watched her laughing and thought. With the clear and uncomplicated certainty that sometimes arrives without warning, I am going to marry this woman. He did not say it that night. He was not an impulsive man, even when he was certain. In August, a man came through Laramie Creek who created a small but significant problem. His name was Amos Briley, and he was a land agent from a company based in Fort Worth that was buying up grazing acreage in West Texas on behalf of a syndicate of Eastern investors. He was well dressed for the territory, wore a city suit that had survived the journey badly, and he had the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to getting what he came for. He came to the Crosswind Ranch on a Wednesday morning and made David an offer on the property that was generous by the standards of 1883 Texas land prices, and that David turned down before Briley had finished presenting it. Briley adjusted his offer upward by 15% and David turned it down again. "Mr. Ford," Briley said, with the careful reasonableness of a man who has practiced patience as a professional skill, "I understand the attachment to land you have worked yourself, but this is a considerable sum. You could buy twice the acreage somewhere else, somewhere easier to work." "I do not want somewhere else," David said. "I want this. The syndicate is prepared to go higher." "The syndicate can keep going higher until they tire themselves out. The Crosswind is not for sale." Briley left. He came back 2 days later and made a higher offer, and David turned it down with the same calm finality, and Briley left again, and that was the end of it. The syndicate moved on to other properties and the Crosswind stayed as it was. Lenora heard about the offers from Eli, and she asked David about it that evening at supper with a directness he appreciated. "Eli says they offered substantially." "They did, and you refused." "I did." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because this is home," he said. "Because I built it to be home and it is becoming that, and home is not a thing you sell." She held his gaze for a long moment and then nodded once, as though something had been confirmed for her. She did not say anything more about it, but he noticed that she looked around the kitchen that evening, at the lamp and the table and the window with the dark outside, with an expression that was proprietary in the same way the land is proprietary to a person who has put their hands in its soil. The school year ended in early September according to the provisional schedule, and Commissioner Greer came out personally to observe a final class session, which he did with a thoroughness that surprised even Lenora. He stayed for 2 hours, watched her teach reading and arithmetic and a history lesson about the Republic of Texas, and he spoke to several of the students, and he watched Caleb Marsh read aloud from the 3rd grade reader, which Caleb did with the contained pride of someone who has earned something hard. After the students were dismissed, Greer stood in the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands and told Lenora that the county would be renewing her contract, this time for a full year at a salary increase of 12%, and that he would be recommending to the county commission that the school building be given a proper repair budget. Lenora thanked him with the same professional composure she had shown in his office 4 months earlier, and when he was gone she sat down at her desk and was still for a moment and then laughed, quietly, with her eyes bright. She looked over at David, who had been organizing firewood in the back corner of the schoolhouse during the session because he happened to be passing and there had been a task to do. "I am staying," she said. "I know," he said. The September evening was warm and soft when they walked back toward where the horses were tied, and the light was going golden and long across the main street of Laramie Creek, and David stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and said, "Lenora." She turned. "I need to say something to you that I have been carrying around since July," he said. "I am going to say it plainly because I think you prefer plain." "I do," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since at least the windmill and probably before. I would like, with your permission, to court you properly and, if you are willing, to ask you to marry me. Not because the ranch needs a mistress or because the east bedroom needs to be properly occupied. Because you are the person I want to spend my life with. Because this place is better when you are in it, and I am better when you are in it, and I would like not to spend any more time being careful about saying so." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was full on her face. She was a woman who had crossed from Missouri to Texas by accident and had made something real out of what she found there. And what was in her face now was not surprise, exactly, but rather the expression of someone hearing spoken, aloud, what they have been thinking clearly for some time. "David Ford," she said, "I have been in love with you since the morning you carried my trunk into the house without being asked, and then showed me a room that was built with care for someone who was not there to see it. And I thought, what a person builds tells you everything about what they value, and I saw what you valued, and it was everything I had always wanted to find." He stepped forward and she met him halfway, because that was how she did everything, and he kissed her there on the edge of the Laramie Creek boardwalk in the September evening light, and it was the first genuinely unguarded moment he had allowed himself in over a year, and it was very good. Eli, who had come to town for grain and was passing on the other side of the street, saw them. He stopped. He looked. He put his hat back on his head with an air of deep personal satisfaction and walked on. They were married in October, 6 months after Lenora Vaughn had arrived at the Laramie Creek depot with a trunk, a carpet bag, and a ticket made out to the wrong ranch. The ceremony was in the town's small church, and it was not a large affair, but it was a full one. Dorothea in her best dress with tears she firmly denied afterward. Eli in the same battered hat, because he had owned no other. Commissioner Greer and his wife. Tom Hadley from the depot. And 11 children from the school who had been allowed by their parents to attend on the condition that they behaved, which they did with the concentrated effort of children who are genuinely invested in the occasion. Lenora's sister Clara, not the same Clara, a coincidence that made David quietly and privately amused, came from Boston for the wedding, arriving on the stage 3 days before and looking at the Texas landscape with the expression of someone encountering an entirely foreign country, which she was. She was warm and sharp-witted and clearly loved her sister without reservation, and by the second day, she and Dorothea had formed the kind of alliance that would sustain a lengthy correspondence for the next 20 years. Lenora wore a dress of deep green wool, which Dorothea had helped her make and which turned her eyes to something remarkable, and she carried a small bunch of late-blooming prairie flowers tied with a ribbon, and when she walked down the church aisle on Commissioner Greer's arm, her father having died 2 years prior, she looked at David with the same direct steadiness she gave to everything, and in it was no performance and no nervousness. Only the clear and specific happiness of a person exactly where they intend to be. He could not have said afterward what the minister said, because he was watching her face. The vows he said clearly, because he meant every word of them. They spent their wedding night at the Crosswind, and in the morning the ranch was the same, the cattle, the horses, the creek, the Cedar Ridge, and entirely different, because the east bedroom door was open and her things were mixed with his things, and the house was finally what it had been designed to be. He had built it for a woman who left. The right woman had arrived by accident, and she was staying. That first winter of their marriage was cold, but not cruelly so. Lenora kept teaching through November and into December, when the school closed for the winter break. She spent the long evenings at the kitchen table preparing the next term's curriculum, and David kept the accounts, and the lamp burned between them, and Eli sometimes came in for supper and stayed too long by the fire, but neither of them minded because Eli was part of the family in the way that people who have worked the same land for years become part of whatever family the land belongs to. Snow came in January, which was unusual for that part of Texas but not unheard of, and the cattle had to be pushed toward the creek bottom for shelter, and the horses needed extra feed, and it was a week of hard, cold work. Lenora came out to help with the feeding on the second day, wrapped in her heavy coat and a scarf Dorothea had knitted her, and she carried the feed buckets without complaint and made sure the barn cats were inside. The sight of her in the frozen barnyard in the January morning, breath clouding, moving with that purposeful competence of hers, made David stop in the middle of his work and just look at her for a moment. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "You are remarkable," he said simply. "I am cold," she said, "and these buckets are heavy. Come and help." He laughed and came and helped, and Biscuit the cat watched from his improbable position on the highest barn shelf, blinking slowly. Spring arrived, and with it the news that Lenora was expecting, which came to David one morning in March when she told him at breakfast with the same clear directness she brought to everything, and he sat very still for a moment, and then stood up from the table and went around to her and held her with a tenderness that surprised them both in its intensity. "Are you well?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said, into his shoulder. "Somewhat nauseated in the mornings, which Dorothea says is entirely normal and indicates a healthy situation." "You have already told Dorothea. She noticed before I did. The woman is uncanny." He laughed, feeling it move through his whole chest. He thought of the ranch, of the 640 acres, of the house he had built with rooms enough for a family, and the thought arrived whole and simple. "This is what I built it for, not for Clara Whitfield, not for a name or an idea, but for exactly this." The school year ran through June, and Lenora taught through May with no particular difficulty. Because she was one of those women who carries a pregnancy with businesslike efficiency, and refused to let it alter her work schedule beyond what was medically advised. Dorothea monitored the situation with the intensity of someone who has appointed themselves medical officer, and took the role seriously. Their son was born in late October of 1884, a healthy, loud, entirely opinionated infant who arrived in the world at 2 in the morning in the bedroom of the Crosswind Ranch with Dorothea in attendance, and David in the hall because Dorothea had sent him there firmly, and he had not dared argue. When Dorothea let him in, Lenora was sitting up in the bed with the infant in her arms, tired and flushed and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen, and she looked up at him with eyes that were full and clear and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this new person who was remarkably small and had a great deal of dark hair and was regarding the world with an expression of evaluative suspicion that David recognized immediately as Lenora's. "He looks skeptical," David said. "He gets that from me," Lenora said. "The dark hair he gets from you. What shall we name him?" She had thought about this. "William," she said, "for my father, and Eli for the middle name." From the hall, they heard Eli Crockett clear his throat in a way that suggested he had heard this and was deeply moved and was determined that no one would know it. "William Eli Ford," David said. "It is a good name." "It is a strong name," Lenora said, looking down at the baby. "He will need one." William Ford grew up knowing two things with equal certainty: that the Crosswind Ranch was the best place in Texas, and that his mother could answer any question he brought her. He was a serious child in the way his mother was serious, observant, thorough, not given to drama, and he had his father's capacity for steady, patient work, which showed itself first in the way he followed David around the ranch from the time he could walk, watching how things were done with the same careful attention Lenora brought to lesson planning. Caleb Marsh, Lenora's student who had learned to read from the McGuffey primer, came to work at the Crosswind in the summers once he was 14, because his family had a small place to the east and could spare him in the seasons. He was a good worker and a better reader by then, working his way through whatever books the Crosswind house held, and Lenora had long since taken a particular pride in him that she extended to all her students, but that was sharpest and most specific in Caleb's case, because his was the story she had wanted most to change. In the spring of 1886, Lenora discovered she was expecting again, and this time David did not have to be told by someone else first. He noticed on his own, which was itself a measure of how well they knew each other now, and when he said, carefully, "Lenora, are you feeling well?" she looked at him with that contained amusement and said, "Better than last time already." Their daughter arrived in November of 1886, born in the same bedroom as her brother, with the same Dorothea in attendance and the same David in the hall, though this time Eli sat with him, and they drank coffee together in the lamplit hallway, and Eli told David, in a sideways and indirect way that was entirely characteristic of him, that he had never seen a man changed for the better as thoroughly as David had been changed, and David said that he thought Eli gave him too much credit. And Eli said he did not think he gave him nearly enough, and this was the most sustained emotional conversation the two of them had ever had. The girl was named Margaret, for Lenora's grandmother. She came into the world with a clear, fierce cry and a grip on David's offered finger that was, in his assessment, stronger than William's had been. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's constitution, built for weather, and she was from the first day a child who intended to be present in whatever room she occupied. The Crosswind Ranch by 1887 was a different thing from what David had driven the last nail into 4 years earlier. The herd was up to 80 head of good stock. The horse operation had expanded to include a small breeding program for working quarter horses, which brought buyers out from as far as San Antonio. The kitchen garden was now a proper kitchen garden, properly fenced, with enough variety that they rarely needed to buy vegetables from town, except in the depths of winter. The schoolhouse in Laramie Creek had been properly repaired and expanded by one additional room, the second room used for older students who were now studying at a higher level than the original curriculum had anticipated. Lenora had become the kind of teacher that parents in the county spoke about with a specific reverence, not because she was soft or sentimental, because she was neither, but because every child who went through her classroom left knowing something real, and knowing that they had been seen and taken seriously by someone whose opinion of them mattered. She was 29 years old in 1887, and she was at the full height of what she was, which was considerable. She was still the woman who adapted the biscuit recipe and rode Patience across the south pasture in the summer heat, and sat at the kitchen table by lamplight with her lesson plans. But she was also now the woman whose name the county knew, whose students were growing up into capable adults, whose ranch was one of the better-run operations in the area. David looked at her across the supper table one evening in the summer of 1887 and thought, as he did with some regularity, about the letter in the telegram his father had sent when Clara Whitfield left. Not that he had told his father the details, but the old man had known something was wrong and had written a letter full of the particular awkward comfort that fathers attempt with sons who are grieving, and in it he had said, "The Lord makes no mistakes in timing, only in our understanding of it." David had not found that particularly comforting at the time. He found it entirely true now. One evening in the fall of 1887, he told Lenora about Clara Whitfield, properly, the whole of it. They were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, the night clear and full of stars, and he told her about the 2 years of courtship and the decreasing letters and the last envelope, and the burning of the letter in the fireplace, and the evening on the porch looking at the stars with the empty house behind him. She listened without interruption, and without the kind of careful neutral face that people put on when they are managing their reaction. She simply listened the way she always did, fully and without performance. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Then she said, "I am glad she went to Austin." He looked at her. "Not unkindly," she said. "Just honestly. Because if she had stayed, you would have been the right man in the wrong life, and she would have been the right woman in the wrong life, and this," she gestured at the house, "the dark land, the stars, would not exist. And this is the right life." She turned and looked at him, "for both of us." He reached over and took her hand. "Yes," he said, "it is." The night was wide and quiet around them, and the crosswind stretched out in every direction, 640 acres of honest ground, and the lamplight from the kitchen window lay warm on the porch floor, and inside William was sleeping with the reliable solidity of a child who is safe, and Margaret was sleeping in the next room with her hands fisted and her face determined even in sleep, and Eli's cabin light was on to the south. And Dorothea had left a pie on the kitchen counter that morning, and the smell of it had lasted all day. The next spring, in 1888, Eli turned 67, and his knees began to make work harder than it had been, and David quietly took on more of the heavy work without comment, and Lenora quietly arranged with Dorothea that the evening meal would always include the things that helped with joint pain, the beef broth, the ginger she ordered specially. And neither of them said a word about it to Eli directly, because Eli was a man who accepted help most comfortably when it was not identified as such. Caleb Marsh came back that summer at 16, and by now could do everything David needed in the field. And David paid him fairly and worked alongside him in the way that the best employers do, as colleagues in the work rather than supervisor and subordinate. Caleb had started talking about maybe studying law someday, and Lenora had given him 2 books on the subject that she had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, and the look Caleb gave her when she handed them to him was the look of a person understanding for the first time that something they had imagined for themselves might actually be reachable. That fall, David and Lenora rode out to the south pasture on a Saturday afternoon, leaving William in Dorothea's care and Margaret asleep in the house, and they stopped at the windmill tower and tied the horses in the same place they had tied them 5 years before. They sat in the shade of the tower as they had before, but the afternoon was different now. The south pasture showing better than it had, the windmill turning properly, the cedar ridge the same deep purple blue it always was. "Do you remember what you said here?" she asked. "I do," he said, "most of it. You said the house felt empty until me." "It did," she leaned against his shoulder. "It is not empty now." "No," he said. "It is exactly full." She laughed at that, the full open laugh, and he felt it against his shoulder and in his chest and across the whole afternoon. He put his arm around her, and she settled against him, and they looked out at the south pasture and the cedar ridge and the afternoon sky, which was the same wide, impossible blue it always was in Texas, as though the sky was doing its best to be equal to the land beneath it. "I used to think," Lenora said, "that the life I was going to make for myself would be a very solitary one, a schoolteacher's life, purposeful but quiet. I did not imagine," she paused, and the pause was full and warm rather than sad, "I did not imagine this. This being, all of it, the ranch, you, William and Margaret, Dorothea telling me what I am doing wrong in the kitchen and being correct every time, Eli pretending not to be moved by anything and being moved by everything." She turned to look at him. "This whole extraordinary, ordinary life." He looked at her, and what he felt for her was so familiar now and so specific and so large that it was simply the ground beneath everything, the way the land was the ground beneath the ranch. It had been there so long now that it was structural, and the thought of it not being there was no more conceivable than the thought of the 640 acres folding up and blowing away. "You came here by accident," he said. "I came here by exactly the right mistake," she said. He kissed her, there in the shade of the windmill tower, with the south pasture open around them and the afternoon holding everything steady, and it was, as all their kisses had been since the first one on the boardwalk, entirely without pretense or performance, just 2 people who had found each other by the particular grace of something going wrong in the best possible way. By the spring of 1889, 6 years after Lenora had arrived at the Laramie Creek Depot with a ticket made out to the wrong place. The Crosswind Ranch was among the most prosperous medium-sized operations in that part of West Texas. The cattle numbered over 100 head. The horse program was known throughout the county and into the next county over. The kitchen garden produced enough through summer and into fall that Lenora was trading surplus with the Hendricks family at the dry goods store in exchange for goods, which was not formal commerce, but was the kind of practical mutual arrangement that defined community in small western towns. William was 4 years old and was following his father with a wooden tool that David had carved him, helping in the way that 4-year-olds help, which is to say with enormous enthusiasm and limited practical effect, but great goodwill. He had begun asking Lenora to read to him every evening with the dedicated persistence of a child who has understood that reading is a door to everything, which was exactly what she had hoped he would understand. Margaret was 2.5 and was demonstrating, as she grew, a personality so forthright and decisive that Eli had said privately to Dorothea that if she was not running something significant by the time she was 30, he would be astonished. Dorothea had said she thought 25 was more likely. Commissioner Greer had appeared at the beginning of the school year with an offer from the county. He wanted to establish a second school in the Northern District, and he wanted to know if Lenora could recommend a teacher. She had recommended a woman she had corresponded with in San Antonio, a teacher named Frances Ockafer, who had been struggling to find a placement despite her credentials, and Greer had hired her, and Frances had arrived in March and been not entirely prepared for West Texas, but had taken to it with admirable determination. Lenora had met Frances at the stage depot, appropriately, and had helped her settle in the way that she herself had been helped, with practical directness and without condescension. The two women had become friends in the manner of women who share a profession and a particular kind of stubbornness, and Frances came to supper at the Crosswind once a month and played chess with David, which she won more often than he did, and which he found genuinely bracing. One evening in the April of 1889, David and Lenora sat on the front porch after supper, which they had begun doing habitually in the warm months, because the evenings in Texas were so beautiful that it seemed wrong to spend them indoors. And the children were in bed, and the night was soft, and the creek was audible from the south, and Eli's light was on in his cabin, and there was the sound of Biscuit the cat landing from some considerable height in the barn. "I have been thinking about the south pasture," David said. "In what sense? I would like to run another 40 head next year. The water tank is adequate now that the windmill is right and the grass is good this spring." "Then do it," she said. "You know the land better than I do." "I know the cattle end," he said. "You know the account end. I need you to look at the figures and tell me if it makes sense." She tilted her head. "You could look at the figures yourself." "I could, but you see things in them I miss." He looked at her sideways. "You always have." She smiled at that. "I will look at them tomorrow." "I know you will." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and his arm went around her in the familiar way it always did, and they looked at the Texas night, which was immense and full of stars and absolutely indifferent to human happiness or sorrow, the way the land was indifferent, the way the honest things are indifferent. They simply are, and what you make of them is your own doing. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was not a question she asked often, because she was not a woman who needed constant reassurance of the obvious. But it was April, and the night was beautiful, and sometimes the obvious is worth saying aloud. He thought about Clara Whitfield's letter burning in the fireplace. He thought about the first evening on the porch, looking at the empty house. He thought about Lenora Vaughn sitting on her trunk at the depot with her back straight and her hands folded, and her green eyes fixed on the middle distance, composing herself against an unexpected situation, being so entirely and particularly herself that he had known within the first 20 minutes that she was unlike anyone he had met before, even if it had taken him considerably longer to know what to do with that knowledge. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said. By a significant margin, she pressed closer to his side. "Good," she said, "so am I." The night held them both on the porch of the Crosswind Ranch, which David Ford had built for a woman who left, and which had stood waiting, honestly and without pretense, for the right woman to arrive by exactly the wrong stage. And in the east bedroom, the room he had built with someone else in mind, William Ford slept with his dark hair across his forehead and his breath small and steady. And in the next room Margaret Ford slept with her fists curled and her face pointed at the future. And Dorothea would be there in the morning at 6:30, because she always was. And Eli would be at the south pasture before dawn, because the cattle did not wait for sentiment. And the creek would move in its course through the dark. And the windmill would turn in the night wind, and the cedar ridge would be purple-blue when the light came back, and the 640 acres of the Crosswind would be exactly what they had always been: honest land for people honest enough to deserve it. And in the morning, Lenora Vaughn Ford would put on her coat and walk to the schoolhouse in the early light, and her children would grow up in the rooms their father had built, and the spaces their mother had filled with purpose. And the Crosswind Ranch would be what every good thing is when it has been built by steady hands and filled by the right love. Not what was planned, not what was dreamed of in some simpler imagining, but something truer and more complete than either, the way the best things always are. Entirely unexpected and exactly right.